You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
Welcome. We are going to be talking philosophy today. We're going to take a brief break from Tragedy and Hope, and that's just because that book is so long and boring. And I think you're going to thank me for taking a brief break from it. And just a little interlude, we're going to come back to it. We'll have just probably 2 more lectures of Tragedy and Hope before we're done. But it's so long and technical and boring that we got to have some break from the monotony. And we got to deal with some other topics, some other subjects that I think will be relevant, because I've had a lot of people ask. I said, where do I start here? What's a good place to begin as I look into your material and your work, right? And so we've got the philosophy and the theology, and there's also the geopolitics and the Hollywood stuff. And so here we're going to be looking more at philosophy. We're going to be looking at the ways in which I think we need to approach our worldviews. And that's what basic philosophy is essentially the understanding of how we form and gain a worldview. So we're going to talk about the 3 basic branches of philosophy, but we're going to specify just metaphysics today. We're going to be talking about basic metaphysics, what it is, why it's important, why it's been lost in the modern world, especially in the West and America, due to various influences such as pragmatism. But we're going to go back and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty ideas of the Greeks, as well as what I believe is kind of a synthesis of some of the positive aspects of, say, Plato or Aristotle and the Greeks with biblical theology, and how we get a very well-rounded, revealed anthropology that everything else in our worldviews is going to kind of hang on. And throughout the course of philosophy, we can see in history, when you divorce anthropology from this kind of a revealed framework that we're going to talk about, what you get is basically disaster, and you get things like reductionistic materialism and so forth that ultimately wipe out the notion of what it is to be a human person. And when there's no notion of a human person, then things like free will, volition, these all fall away by the wayside, because they're ultimately illusory. If the world is a determined materialistic process, then free will is illusory, and so is consciousness. So we're going to be talking about all those things today. And the book that we're going to be working from as the intro to basic metaphysics, which I found this to be the best synthesis prior to the medieval scholastic period of Roman Catholicism or Thomas Aquinas. We're going to be looking to the figure of John of Damascus. Now, John of Damascus has a great work that is called The Fount of Knowledge, and he calls it subtitled The Philosophical Chapters, or it's been titled this, The Philosophical Chapters. So we're going to be looking at that, and we're going to go through the highlights of this book that will function as our introduction to basic metaphysics. Now, I've read all of this and all of John's writings as it relates to his famous book On the Orthodox Faith. I would recommend that down the road if you're more interested in something a little more advanced. His book, smaller book in here, On Heresies, is very good, as it shows that the divergences on God and the person of the Logos, or Christ, these will actually lead to all errors possible. It's a very radical thesis, but I think it's a great argument, especially for apologetics. But today we're going to be talking about the basic principles that he outlines in his philosophical chapters. And the reason we're going to do that first is because after that, we're going to move to the more dense, hardcore theological arguments that will be followed up in the small book that is the debate between St. Maximus the Confessor and Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus was what we call a monothelite, and that he believed that in Christ there was only one will and one energy. And we're going to get into all that. We're going to see how important that is, because from this, what we're going to see is that all errors in our worldviews ultimately kind of pivot or hinge on these things. And because of one error leading to another error, you can see how down the road theological discrepancies and making big mistakes in our worldview will actually lead to larger scale errors in how we understand things and how we operate, because it's not just a matter of theoria or theological or theoretical knowledge, it's also praxis. So theopraxis is what's relevant here, and the way that we think about the world, the way that we believe, has a big effect on how we act in the world, and that's why these things are going to be important. So today we're going to start with, as we said, what are the three basic branches of philosophy? Well, we have epistemology, which is essentially just how we know what we know, the doctrine of knowledge. Where do we get our knowledge? How do we justify our beliefs? Can they be justified? Is all knowledge relative, or are there some truths that are absolutely certain such that they cannot be doubted? Is there a middle category for these things? Are some things partially certain? Are some things unknowable? Can we doubt everything? So forth. These are the kind of questions that apply to epistemology. From the Greek, the basic of episteme, which is, again, knowledge. Now, ethics, of course, this should be pretty obvious. This is the basic ideas of how do we know what's right and wrong, what's good, what's bad. Value judgments, moral judgments, these fall under the category of ethics. But today, for our purposes, what we're going to be looking at is metaphysics. And this is so important because this is, in the course of the modern world, modern philosophy, this doesn't exist anymore. This has been crossed out. It's now been replaced by something like physics, and more so physico-materialism. The ideas of consciousness now are classed under metaphysics and things that must be tossed aside, right? Free will, the spirit in man, angels, devils, all these things are classified as metaphysics and have been essentially tossed away as no longer relevant. Why? Well, because of, as we're going to see here in a minute, the rise and prevalence of certain philosophies and ideologies that were promoted for the purpose, I think, ultimately of social engineering in the long run. But I think they began as bad philosophy and bad ideas that weren't curbed or refuted adequately. And so down the road, you just have the outworking, the logical self-consistency of these errors playing themselves out over several centuries. And that's what we're going to see, especially in the West, when we get to the time of the Reformation, the rise of nominalism, Luther, Gabriel Bile, Calvin, these different reformers, as well as in Roman Catholicism, similar patterns and trends that will lead to things like Thomism and then the Counter-Reformation and so forth. But all of these developments in the West are going to be kind of constantly overturning and revolutionizing, right? Whereas in the East, it's more so a situation of stasis in terms of the theology, because the theology still has a central role in determining the outlook, the metaphysic, right? And we're going to see that obviously continued into places like Russia. Now, we're not going to get deep into that. We're going to focus on these more formative, basic periods of how the church and how the eight ecumenical councils essentially hammered out these doctrines of anthropology through Christology. So what we're going to see is that Christology is going to directly affect and give us a basis for our doctrine of man. And we believe that that would be revealed, right? So it's not just something that you can go out there and study like under a microscope. It's actually something that's revealed. And this again comes to us from the 8 ecumenical councils. And these are the councils under and convened by the emperors that are part of the oikumene, which is where we get ecumenical, the universal church, the universal empire, right? And so these 7 to 8 councils, these take place in the first 1,000 years of the church. And as the doctrine of Christian theology and Christianity spreads throughout the empire, east and west, you have a more or less united church for the first 1,000 years that's going to, through these giant councils, hammer out a consistent pattern. And they don't contradict. There's a consistent pattern of theology based on the person of Christ, this Logos, right, which is the Greek for reason, meaning, logic, explication, right? This revealed anthropology around this is how we're going to understand the proper anthropology of man, and then thus man's ills and man's healing. And so all of this is crucial, and you can't do proper theology without this. And so we would say, as Eastern theology, that what's missing in Protestantism is precisely this. Protestant theology doesn't really do this or have this because Protestant theology, and by extension all of its schisms in evangelical theology, it really begins after the period when this begins to be crossed out. So with the rise of scientific revolution, scientism and so forth, Protestant Reformation, humanism, this begins to be seen as useless. And of course, by the time of Darwinism and so forth, this is completely gone, right? So more recent evangelical movements don't even know what this is. But as we're going to see, the Bible and the patristic philosophy of the first several centuries of the church, all the way at least for the first 1,000, is impregnated with this. It's full of these ideas, and especially the Greek New Testament usages of a lot of these terms that we're going to look at show us, again, a wide-ranging scope of anthropology, and not just anthropology, but also Christology, cosmology, and ultimately the relationship of God to the world as a whole. So that's why this is going to be so important. And really all you get in Protestantism is maybe some kind of attempt to work out epistemology, how we know what we know. Calvinists do this quite often. They try to figure out, having certainty on XYZ proposition or whatever, or how can we distinguish natural knowledge from revealed knowledge or whatever. And they might try to do ethics, but they cannot and will not be able to do metaphysics because they are birthed from a period in which metaphysics begins to be denied under what we call nominalism. And we're going to see what that is and look at that more in depth here in a moment. But that's going to serve as our intro here, as you see. And as I said, we will be working from a rough outline of the book of The Fount of Knowledge by St. John of Damascus. So if you want to take notes, that would be good. Of course, the first hour is always free, and then the second hour will be for paid subscribers. And you can subscribe at jaysanalysis.com for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. And you can also get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, where I apply all of this philosophy and worldview analysis to film, to the biggest films that have ever been, like Spielberg films, right? Bond films and so forth. And so Kubrick films, you can get a good in-depth philosophical analysis of Hollywood and its messages there. But here we're gonna continue into looking at the subjects of the person of Christ and how it gives us a revealed anthropology, and how this is much more, I think, stable and consistent than anything that the modern world has to offer, which really has nothing to offer. It can only offer no metaphysics and anti-metaphysics, ametaphysics. Then by extension, it ultimately has no epistemology and can really only offer us physicalism. That's the only option that the modern world ends up having, and that's a dead-end nihilistic turn. So to get real philosophy, to get good philosophy, you have to go back to these things, and that's what we're going to do today. Now we're going to begin by some of the introductory statements that St. John makes, and again, this is Fount of Knowledge, the philosophical chapters. And he begins by saying an interesting quote that's reminiscent of Platonism, insofar as he says, "I who am defiled and stained with every sort of sin, and bear within myself the tumultuous seas of my conjectures, who have neither purified my mind nor my understanding, but rather that they may serve as a mirror of God and his divine reflections." And this is the idea that what Plato talked about when he mentioned the forms, John is appropriating that and saying that we, in our minds, our human minds, do in a sense have a mirror reflection of the ideas of God. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a correct theological approach. And that's how we can, in a way, see that Plato has some usage, although we, again, reject, of course, the overarching teachings of Plato as a whole, because they end up being problematic in a very fundamental sense. But John says the relationship of revelation to philosophy is such that I will set forth the best contributions of the Greek philosophers, because wherever there is good and truth, it has been given to men from above by God. It comes down from the Father of lights, quoting James 1:17. If there is anything contrary to the truth, then it is, of course, the invention of Satan, and we will reject those things. So a fair and balanced approach to philosophy in the Greeks there by John. And he says that what we're going to do in philosophy is seek true gnosis, right? Not Gnosticism of the heretical teachers of the first few centuries, but true gnosis. And true gnosis is the light of the rational soul that banishes ignorance, he says. And so it is proper for rational beings, humans with rationality, for rational beings, to seek knowledge and to banish ignorance, right? So education is good, philosophy is good. These are all proper. And John cites, of course, Colossians 2:3, that all things adhere in Christ, who is the Logos. And so that's why logic and logos relate directly to philosophy, right? Logic, truth, and explication are all in some way related to the logos. So he does say that philosophy is in a way a handmaiden to theology, something that Aquinas will say later. Nothing wrong with that. It's a true statement. If then we are lovers of learning, then we shall learn much. And it is of the nature of all things that they may be apprehended through industry and toil. And all these, of course, come to God through grace. Come to us from God's grace. So human toil and so forth, these are operations that we engage in to obtain the truth. Truth doesn't come automatically or simply without some study and toil. And that's why I think, for example, you can't rely on hallucinogens or something like this as some sort of shortcut to truth. It has to be through a lot of years of research, through a lot of time and toil. And, many of the Eastern Fathers say that. So what is philosophy? Well, according to St. John, chapter 3, philosophy is the knowledge of the things which are, insofar as they are. Now that sounds a little obtuse, but what he's saying is that we want to move beyond appearances and actually see things as they are in truth, in reality. And so it is a knowledge of the nature of things which have being. So for St. John, the beginning of philosophy, contrary to so many moderns, is not ethics, it's not epistemology, it is metaphysics. Philosophy is metaphysics, essentially. Now, other questions like how do we know things and so forth, these certainly come into play, and they will be related to metaphysics, because all three of the branches, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, hang or fall together. They all stand together. They're all connected. You can't do one without the other, because anytime, for example, you were to make a claim about truth, a truth claim, you would be thereby also assuming that it's ethically appropriate or necessary to maintain the truth, right? It assumes some value to truthfulness. Any time you say that something is true, you're also making a metaphysical statement that it exists or subsists in some way or some mode or some means, and so therefore you're also making a metaphysical statement. There's all sorts of other assumptions that are presupposed in an epistemic claim or proposition that apply to metaphysics. For example, if you say I exist, that's not just a knowledge claim, it's also a claim of metaphysics, because it includes the notion of I, or the subject, right, which is a metaphysical question. So you can't slice these up and divide them up like modern philosophy tries to do. It's all part of the modernist project, which is all, again, a disastrous, doomed failure. Philosophy is the art of arts and the science of sciences, he says. It is the principle of every art, and since it is through every art that science, since through it every art and science has been invented. So it's through philosophy that we get all the arts and sciences. True philosophy is the love of wisdom, and because God is true wisdom, true philosophy is the love of God, according to St. John. So that's our starting point. And for St. John, classical pedagogy includes math, music, right? All these things, and these have to be in harmony with the virtues. And so, in a way that we could say here that all the way back in the 8th century, when St. John is writing this in the 750s, there was already a kind of a developed notion of classical pedagogy, classical education. So the ideas of trivium and quadrivium are not invented by 20th century guys. These are ancient ideas that have always been combined with theology, especially in the Church Fathers, all the way back to St. Basil, here in St. John, and then later in St. Theosis of Constantinople, who will also be an advocate for this kind of classical pedagogy. Now, we're not going to talk about math and all that, really. We're going to mainly focus on kind of the more basic terms of philosophy, which are, I think, most relevant for us. But I always love this fact that if you've listened to or read much of my stuff, you know that I advocate transcendental argumentation or transcendental arguments. I think they're more in line with the philosophy that we hold to in Orthodox theology. And this is a kind of apologetic approach that's, I think, better than the standard evangelical or evidential approaches, because it can include evidential approaches, but it's not entirely reliant upon them as means or methods alone, because that's faulty. All right, you can't just show somebody evidences because their worldview is already going to determine how they interpret the evidences. So what you have to do is begin to question the foundations of their worldview to begin with, their presuppositions, and that's really what we do in transcendental argumentation. And on pages 12 and 13 of this copy, St. John actually offers a transcendental argument. He says, well, what would we say to someone who says, there is no philosophy, you can't do philosophy, it's impossible? There are people who have endeavored to do away entirely with philosophy, he says. People who, by asserting that philosophy does not exist, or that there's no knowledge whatsoever or perception at all, we shall endeavor to ask them, how is it that you say that there's neither philosophy nor knowledge nor perception? Do you know and perceive this? How did you come to know and perceive this? Right? So this is that basic transcendental argument that I hammer home so often. We've seen people like Dr. Greg Bahnsen point this out for many years. And it's good. It's a true argument. And here it is in St. John of Damascus in the 8th century. So we know there's some validity. We know there's validity to that. It's the appropriate starting point of how to approach these questions. Now, the beginning of division is philosophy concerns what he says concerning reason and dialectic. So we're going to talk about reasoning and dialectic, how we get from point A to point B. And what does he start with? Being. Well, what is being? Being is what is real, what exists, the nature of the things that are out there in the world, be they men, be they angels, etc., and what they are and how we might classify them, taxonomy. And what's interesting is that the taxonomy of Aristotle, all the way back to ancient Greek days, is still in use, right? We still use genera, species, right, so forth, for classification and taxonomy in the animal kingdom. But the irony is that, of course, the modern world claims to no longer believe in metaphysics. So these classifications aren't real. They're just useful tokens, they're called. Token symbols. They're just useful classifications. They don't describe anything really out there in the world. I know that sounds ludicrous, but that is the actual status of philosophy in the modern world. I mean, it's a nightmare dreamscape in which we live, but that is the height of man's wisdom in our day, and knowledge is nonsense and absurdity. They will sit there and say that, yeah, we can talk about classifying things and animals and humans, but in reality, these things aren't real objective differences out in the world. They're just mental distinctions that we've invented through social constructs to help us to make sense of things. But don't ever think that you're actually understanding something that's out there in the external world. That's actually impossible, modern philosophy says. Well, why would they believe such bizarre things. Well, that's because, as the Bible even says, all the way back to Solomon, man's wisdom is made foolishness, right? Because he attempts to reason autonomously on his own, and he ends up in all these stupid, inane positions. And it's been going on for millennia. So we needn't be surprised that the great academics, so-called, of our day believe utterly ludicrous ideas. That's exactly what we were told would happen, especially the further a society moves away from God and from truth and from metaphysics. They're only going to be caught in more and more ridiculous and absurd positions that are ultimately self-destructive. And of course, as we've been pointing out, Jay's analysis more recently in the last several years, that absurdity is not just absurdity, it can actually be weaponized. So you can actually weaponize the inanity and the absurdity and the nonsense, not just in all those other fields, but also in philosophy. Philosophy can be weaponized just like the arts, because it's kind of one of the arts, right? To destroy. So John's going to start talking about kind of basic ideas in metaphysics, and one of those is that we go back to Plato and we talk about the one and the many. Now, what is this? Well, this is just a basic question that Plato asked, and I've talked about this in my Plato lectures if you've heard them, is that how do we make sense of something being, on the one hand, singular in its qualities or properties that it shares with other things, like, for example, dog, not Dog the Bounty Hunter, just a dog. How do we understand that dog, on the one hand, is one, but dog is also many, and that there are many dogs in the world, right? And so how is it that there can be a whole bunch of dogs, and yet they share something between them that makes them part of a class or group, a structure, yet at the same time they're distinct in being many? What is it? Well, this is that kind of question that Plato was asking. So the unity that they share, we would say, or Plato would say, this constitutes an essence or a form or some universal, right? So there's some dogness that's shared between all dogs that makes them dog and not horse or something else, right? Now, the many refers to the particular, right? There's that dog over there, Fido. There's Goofy over there, specific dog, right? There's Spot over here. These are instances of a certain type or classification of thing. And so this very fundamental question that Plato asked is a metaphysical question. And Plato proposed that we can have groupings, a unity, a higher level of unity that's shared amongst these beings, that all of them participate in, and call it whatever you want, call it dogness, form of dog, or the essence, or what it is to be the nature of a dog. And we're going to use essence here to be synonymous with nature. And this does not mean nature in the sense of the plants and the trees out there. We're speaking of a philosophical term of what it is for that thing to be that thing. So what is it for a dog to be a dog? Well, it might be kind of difficult to define the nature of a thing, because, I mean, there could be many things that go into what it is to be a dog, but whatever dog nature or essence is, it's what is shared by all dogs. Now, since we don't have a direct perception from our senses, at least, as it is what it is to be a dog, or the essence of a dog is, I should say, how is it that we perceive natures or forms or universals? Well, Plato said there's a nous, N-O-U-S, and this is the Greek term for what we're going to call, for our purposes, the eye of the soul. And the eye of the soul, the mind's eye perhaps, is not just an intellectual faculty, as we're going to use it and see it in theology. It's also the means by which we know God. So it's an intuitive faculty that God gave man by which he can perceive truth. And so To know the forms or the universals this is something that's known by the nous, the eye of the soul, and seeing these truths directly. And this is very revolutionary, very unique, because this is ultimately going to be lost in the West, especially after 1000 AD. Virtually non-existent. Nowhere there. Gone. And you're going to get these kind of weird, similar approaches. You're going to get a kind of light or illumination theory in St. Augustine. Augustine's going to propose a kind of a version of this, but not what the Eastern theologians teach, because Augustine does not believe in this. He does not believe that there's a nous or a specific aspect of the human faculty by which we can directly see God. Rather, Augustine would say we have a mind or an intellect, but it's this mind or intellect that perceives all of these through the light of God's illumination. We kind of wander through the maze of reality through all of these forms back to the one who is God. So we do not believe that. We do not believe that God is some super essence that we're wandering through the phantasms of life to get back to, as if all of this is not real and we're just kind of wandering through this mental labyrinth of experiences or phenomena that present themselves to our senses or to our mind's eye. No, we believe that there's a world out there. There's a real world. There's nothing bad about it. There's nothing inherently evil about the created world or matter or whatever. But rather that the nous is given to us by which we can see not just God and not just truth in its essence directly, but that by grace we can see all things ultimately in God. And this is where we get to the doctrine of the Logoi, Logoi. And what this means is that all of the principles or archetypes or essences of things that are out there in the world that we see by virtue of the eye of our soul or the nous, that these are ultimately understood to be this. All of the Logoi, the many principles and archetypes of things, are one in the Logos. So the one and the many for Eastern theology is summed up in the Logos and his encapsulation of all the Logoi. So this philosophical problem is remedied in Eastern theology through this. In Western theology, there's an attempt at this through Augustine's light theory and so forth, but I don't believe that it works. And it doesn't work because of what we're going to see later on in Lecture 2 when we get to the debate between Maximus and Pyrrhus, because of what's called absolute divine simplicity. But set that aside for a moment because we're not there yet. We're going to do some more of these basic philosophical and theological terms that are going to give us a grounding by which we can then sort of leap into that next level of discussion. So next we come to building on what we saw before. We're going to look at how the principles that we saw with the one and the many can be further and better explicated and understood through what we're talking about in terms of Orthodox theology. So we have this principle that we get from Plato. It's an idea that's interesting that I think works. It's called Methexis. And this is the idea of participation without loss of identity. And so that question that we saw earlier of the one and the many, one of the problems that might arise from that is, well, if we have a whole bunch of dogs and they're all sharing this property of dogness, but they're all unique, particular individuations or instances of dogs, what about other things that they might share? Like maybe all of these dogs, say in our class, are white. So they all share the property of whiteness, or the quality of whiteness. But if we say that these dogs are white, we're not identifying whiteness with their essence, right? Because some dogs are brown. Not all dogs are white. So whiteness cannot be something that's essential to being a dog, right? And that was what we would call an accidental property. Not accident in the sense of wrecking a car, but in Aristotle's categories, an accident, as opposed to the essence or the substance. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But for our purposes here, we're going to say that we're going to look at this and say that Methexis is the great philosophical insight that we have, that something can participate in a real metaphysical ontological sense. Dogs really do possess whiteness or brownness, right? They really have this quality, and it's a real existing quality that at the same time does not destroy their dogness, and it does not destroy the color brown or white or red or whatever that the dog might have. It's not totally swallowed up in the being of the dog, right? There's the ability for two different properties or qualities to subsist in the same entity without losing their particularity, right? So we can say that a book is square, perhaps, or rectangular. It's solid. It's also numerically one, perhaps. And all of those properties that we say about the book are true, and yet none of those single characteristics sums up the totality of that book, right? So we can have multiplicity existing within a unity without either the multiplicity or the unity being enveloped or dissolved or destroyed or overridden. And why is that? Well, that's because in Orthodox theology, we don't believe that there's some preeminence to the one or some preeminence to the many or some dialectical tension. And this is what, unfortunately, Greek philosophy and Platonism and the history of Western philosophy would do, was they would set up dialectics. And this is the idea that there's a real tension between unity and multiplicity. And you either fall on one of these sides or the other, right? Either unity is preeminent, primary, ontologically superior, or perhaps multiplicity is preeminent and superior to unity. And we're talking about as abstract, ultimate, high-level concepts here. Which one is it? Where do you fall? You say, well, what does this matter? Well, this affects everything. This might affect your view of the government, of nations, of states. Maybe unity in the government, right, and some sort of tyrannical dictatorship is what's preeminent and superior and should be the case. Many tyrants have thought so, right? Or perhaps the many is superior. This would be democratists, democracy proponents, or anarchists. They would say, no, the multiplicity and anarchy and chaos is superior to the tyrannical unity of the great dictator. And so that would be a political example of the manifestation of dialectics. But dialectics is not just political. The political manifestation of dialectics is based on the metaphysical view of dialectics. And so in Orthodox theology, we don't believe that there's some preeminence to the one over the many, or some preeminence to the many over against the one. And this is because in our doctrine of the Trinity, we believe that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all are co-equal in their essence, their divinity, their divine nature. But that unity that the Godhead shares, which is summed up in the Father as the cause of the Godhead, that unity is not superior in a metaphysical sense to the multiplicity in God. And in the same way, in the Logos and his Logoi, his many principles by which he is the architect of creation, and I'm not saying architect in a Masonic sense, I'm saying in an ex nihilo creator and giving matter form sense, right? He is both the unity and the multiplicity in creation. And that's according to Ephesians 1, Colossians 1 and 2. And that's our doctrine of the Logoi. And so in Christ, there's no preeminence to particularity in the many. And there's no preeminence to the fact that, Jesus is more one than he is the many in the Logoi, right? So in both ways, we would say that there's a balance. There's a balance between the one and the many in God, in the Logos and the Logoi, in the church, the way the church is governed, right? There's not one super bishop of pope, right? No God bishop. There is rather an equality because of the one and the many. And God is able to govern the church in this balance between the one and the many just as well as he's able to govern the universe and the many Logoi in the one Logos. So that leads us then to, with this principle of Methexis, participation without loss of identity, to nature. The question of nature. What is nature, or physis in the Greek? This is the common essence that something shares, right? And this is, again, relates to the question of the one and the many. So we can talk about in nature, or in the nature of what it is to be man, right? Humans have a body and a soul and a nous, and that makes up human nature. God is different, although there's some, because we're made in God's image, there's some analogy there. God is different, though. God has a nature, but we don't know what God's nature is. And we say that all the biblical references to the darkness that surrounds the theophanic manifestations of God, the theophanies, you know, Moses says it was great darkness, right? That's because the oneness, or the nature, the essence of God is unknown. We don't know. We'll never know God's essence, because it's, even the seraphim have to cloak their eyes. Well, you can never ever see into the divine essence. And this, to say that you can see the divine essence, is the heresy of Eunomius, and it's one of the errors of Aquinas, repeating the heresy of Eunomius. We do not see God's essence. We will see God face to face in the person of Christ, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. And we see God in his energeia, or his operations, energies. But before we get to that, let's understand again that the nature is what's common, the common essence to all humans. You and I, we share human nature. That's our common essence that we have. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they share common divine nature, whatever that is. We don't know what it is, but it is beyond us, but it is revealed that God has a nature. And when we say that, we call that apophatic theology. That is theology of negation, or to not know. Doesn't mean that we can't make any positive statement about God being wise or just or whatever, but rather that we make a distinction between nature and person, or hypostasis. We make that distinction because it's a revealed distinction. It's very important, and it's a crucial aspect of the theology of the first 1,000 years of the church, in avoiding dialectics and in hammering out the proper Christology and human anthropology that we believe. So apophatic theology just simply means theology by negation, or when we say, for example, God is infinite. Well, humans don't have any direct conception of what infinity is. We know that it's not this, it's not that, it's not a created thing, it's not a fixed set of numbers, right? So it's a non. It's not that, not that, not that, and therefore it's by negation. And that's what apophatic theology means, simply put. And even human nature, there's an aspect to man which is even apophatic. I mean, for example, Scripture says that only the Spirit knows the spirit which is in a man, right? The Spirit of God alone knows the deepness of our spirits. So how then can I, as a human, know the depths of even another human being? So even amongst men and mankind, there's an apophatic aspect to human nature, right? And in nature in general, we saw before, how would you define dog nature? Well, I don't know, but we know that there is some kind of something that archetype or principle, logoi, that makes dogs and not horses, and not chickens and not humans, right? So in the same way, there's something man, and what's revealed is that we have a body, soul, nous, and we're made in the image of God, and that's what makes man much like God, being made in his image. And that Greek word for being made in the image is icon. And this is why iconology and iconography and icons will play such an important role, because we read in Scripture in Hebrews that the Logos is the icon of the Father. He's the direct image of the Father's hypostasis, and that is the Greek word that is used in Hebrews. There at the beginning, Hebrews 1. He's the direct image of the hypostasis of the Father. Now, what is this? This is particular subject, right, or person. And this is very important because we have a doctrine of the human person, a theology, an anthropology of the human person. Most philosophies do not. And they do not because they don't have this anthropology, because they don't have revealed anthropology. In all other philosophies, person just gets smashed into intellect or human nature or soul or whatever. And now in modern philosophy, that's been, as we saw, canceled out. That doesn't exist anymore. So particular human nature is always going to be instantiated in a particular person or hypostasis in the Greek. And this is the personal, specific subject, the locus of action. I am the person, J, the hypostasis, J. You are the person, Bill Cosby, or whoever you are. And so this is going to lead us to another important term that we have to understand, and this is going to help us to understand the incarnation. This is what the fathers will use. Inhypostatize. And while this may sound a little obtuse, don't worry, it's not a big deal. All it is that anytime that nature, human nature, exists in reality, in Ray, actually, all instances of human nature are going to be of a specific hypostasis that's particular, and that's all that means, inhypostatized. So you're never going to find human nature in the abstract. It's always instantiated, right? It's universal, it's common amongst all humans, and it is a real essence, a common essence that we all share, but it's always and only instantiated in a certain mode, which we call inhypostatized, that is, in the human form. Now, so what is a hypostasis? Well, it's just a particular subject, Peter and Paul. And what did Peter and Paul share in common? Human nature. What do the Father and the Son and the Spirit share in common? Divine nature. But they are particular, singular hypostases. Right. Now, the way that we know beings is through the communication of their person, their hypostasis, through their actions, operations, speech, messages, letters, whatever. And this is what we mean by energeia, energies. Right? So this is action, operation that is proper to nature. And we say that because energies are proper to the nature that has that operation. So, for example, God's energies or operations are not the same as man's. There might be some parallel or carryover or analogy, but the way that the divine nature operates is not the same as the way you and I. So when we speak of humans having wisdom, this is not wisdom in a univocal sense, right? So univocal meaning here, the same sense, right? So I don't have God, wisdom in the same sense that God has wisdom, because God is infinitely beyond us, right? Now, we do as humans have the ability to participate in God's wisdom, but God's wisdom is not the same as God's nature. God's wisdom is an energy of the divine nature. And there is a difference between essence and energy. It is a real distinction, right? Just as if I operate in the world to build a house, the actions that I use to build that house are not the same thing as my human nature. They're also not the same thing as the person J, right? Building a house is an action proper to human nature, as is living or thinking or communicating or speaking or anything, but they're not the same thing as me, obviously, right? And so in the same way, God's creation, the created world, or the act of creating the world, not the same thing as his nature. They're distinct. The Father is not the same as the created world, right? And the act of creating was at a specific point. Now, God can continue to create, of course, and he can create in the future. But this is why we believe there's a distinction between the essence of a thing and the thing's operation or energy. Now, those energies are proper to the nature, right? So if I speak, or if I exemplify wisdom or knowledge, hopefully I am, then that wisdom or knowledge is proper to me as a human person and exemplifying the energy of human nature. If God does something, then it is proper to the divine nature, right? So the energies of God are proper to his nature. The energies of man are proper to human nature. And what we believe in theology is that Methexis, that participation without loss of identity, is how we participate in the energies of God. And that's what we will call Theosis, deification. It is the participation of human nature and human persons in the divine energy without the loss of human identity or human nature or submersion into the divine essence. We have nothing to do with the divine essence in the sense of knowing it or seeing it or perceiving it directly. Now, the divine operations or energies, they proceed from the divine nature in that they're proper to him as a divine being. But we never see this or know this. All we know is the direct active energy of God. And that is the crucial distinctions and theological terms that I think have to be understood to understand our theology. Now, for example, energeia is used several times in the New Testament. It's used 3 times in Ephesians. It's used in Philippians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians. Paul speaks of the operations of the Spirit in Corinthians. That's all the Greek word, energeia. And the operations of the Spirit are distinct from the Spirit. So that's why we would say these kinds of things, right? So Paul, when he says in Ephesians 1:19 in the Greek that we know the mighty working of his power, the effectual working of his power in Ephesians 3:7, Ephesians 4:16. That's energeia. Now, his, that refers to God, the divine person, the Father. His power, energeia. Hypostasis, his power. So, we see that these are, again, Greek terms used in the New Testament, many of them. Nous is used in the New Testament. Hypostasis is used in the New Testament. Physis is used in the New Testament. Methexis, I'm not aware of that being in the New Testament, but it's still just a useful concept. Energeia. Peter says we participate in God. Jesus says that in John 17, that you'll share in the immortality and the life and light that he has. And that's that participation in the divine energy. When Jesus is on Mount Tabor and the light is coming out of him, we believe that's the divine energies. So that, I think, is a good discussion of some of these basic terms. Hopefully you can see all those. I know it's getting kind of messy. So we're going to clean that board off and move on to the next section. Well, we're coming close to an hour here, so I want to thank you for listening. And as I said before, this is of course, the free hour. And the second hour is, of course, available to subscribers to Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or $60 a year. And we're going to get into some more St. John's usages of Aristotelian categories here in a moment. We're going to get into substance and accidents and what hylomorphism is and the 4 causes and all this as we look at the usages of Aristotle and the good and the bad there as well. And we're going to see how this also applies to theology and anthropology. And then, as I said, next time we will move on to the Disputations with Pyrrhus by St. Maximus and look at how they hinge upon the theology and the anthropology there is what swings us in any direction towards good theology and philosophy or error and heresy and ultimately the destruction of our worldview. So that's going to be coming up in the next second hour. So be sure and subscribe if you haven't heard that. Also, as I said, you can check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which is all complete on my end. All the sidebars are complete. It's now still ready for pre-order and will be out in the next month or two. So thank you for listening. Check out jaysanalysis.com. And if you like philosophy, if you like this, tell your friends and tell them to sign up and subscribe.